Chapter 1. The Bell Above the Door. The first thing Clara Vale saw was not a person at all, but a child's red wool glove lying on top of a locked glass case of first editions, as though someone had taken it off in a hurry, and then forgotten that forgetting things was dangerous in a place where everything had a value. The glove looked absurd there. It had a wet dark edge from the street and a loose thread at one finger. Around it the books sat upright in their grave dignity, calf and cloth and faded gold, while the brass lamp above the case made the damp thread shine. Clara paused with one hand still on the green-painted door. The bell gave its bright, old-fashioned ring overhead, and from somewhere inside came the soft drag of a stool being moved over boards. The shop smelled not merely of paper, which would have been ordinary, but of old bindings that had lived too close to winter windows, a trace of coal dust caught in curtain hems, and the faint, sweet dryness of lavender polish used on surfaces that did not quite take a shine. It was a smell she had always loved, though one must never admit loving such things too publicly in London, where enthusiasm was quickly treated as hunger. "Do come in properly," said a man's voice from the interior. "Half the warmth goes out with indecision, and there is precious little of that to spare." Ambrose Bell emerged from between the history shelves with his hands spread in cordial welcome. He was a tall man still, though the flesh had settled heavily around his jaw. His silver hair had that disciplined look of hair that cost money to keep accidental. He wore a dark waistcoat, a watch chain, and an expression of permanent tolerance which some people mistake for kindness because it is delivered with a smile. "Miss Vale," he said, "our saviour from chaos." Clara smiled and shook his hand. "I should be careful about promising salvation. I have only come to help with the catalogue for the Lonsdale collection, which, in this place, amounts to the same thing. I have inherited through the carelessness of the dead 3,000 books and no trustworthy pair of eyes for them." He glanced over her shoulder toward the street. "You came alone. Excellent. My nephew has a habit of arriving with opinions, and opinions are the one commodity of which bookshops are never in want." Clara laughed because she was expected to. Behind him she saw the shop in layers. The front room held general stock. The left wall leaned under poetry and essays. The right was given over to travel, biography, and shelves of small antiquarian treasures behind wire mesh. Above, the mezzanine ran like a narrow gallery with railings dark from generations of hands. Beyond the till a curtain of bottle-green serge hung across the passage to the back room. There was movement by the counter. A girl of perhaps 19, brown-haired and thin in the wrists, was wrapping a book in paper so carefully that she seemed to be apologizing to it. She looked up quickly, then looked away. "That is Molly Kemp," Ambrose said. "She saves me from ruin every afternoon and misshelves Bunyan every morning." Molly blushed. "Mr. Bell says that because he likes things placed where only he can find them. That is because only I know where they belong. It is one of the burdens of expertise." Clara set down her case. "You wrote that the Lonsdale books were upstairs. In the back, mostly. We shall begin after tea. One must not hurry into another man's library. The dead resent it." He spoke lightly, but his eyes had already gone beyond her to the little glove on the case. "Molly, whose is that?" "I don't know, sir. It was there when I came from the yard." "How odd." He picked it up between finger and thumb. For the first time something unguarded crossed his face. Not an alarm exactly. Recognition, perhaps, or annoyance sharpened by memory. It was gone at once. "A nuisance," he said. "One accumulates them in trade, dust, debt, and human relics." He dropped the glove behind the counter, but not into the lost property drawer Clara could see standing open. He placed it in the lower cupboard and shut the door with more force than the occasion required. Then he turned back to her smiling. Tea was served in the back room by Mrs. Pritchard, who did not work there but seemed the sort of woman who attached herself to premises and then took moral possession of them. She lived next door, as Clara learned within 3 minutes, had known the shop for 20 years, distrusted everyone under 40, and had come in only to make certain that Mr. Bell was not overdoing things again, because clever men often have less common sense than a sparrow in a saucepan. "You remind me," Miss Marple said later, settling herself with a cup and a plate balanced steadily on one knee, "of Mrs. Harmon in St. Mary Mead. She took it upon herself to supervise the butcher's diet for nearly 11 years, though she was no relation, and had once accused him of adulterating sausages with a look of deep Christian sorrow. People do grow proprietary about those they disapprove of. It has the most intimate quality." Clara had not noticed Miss Marple enter. That, she later reflected, was common enough with Miss Marple, who seemed to arrive not by movement but by having been there already in some morally important sense. Ambrose Bell bent over her hand. "My dear Miss Marple honours us. You know Miss Vale, who is to rescue me from my own accumulations." "I am sure she will try," said Miss Marple. "Young women who catalogue things generally do, though it is often surprising what people put in the wrong place, and how determined they are to leave it there." The remark was made pleasantly. Clara thought nothing of it at the time, except that Miss Marple's blue eyes had moved very gently toward the locked lower cupboard behind the till. During tea, the little company expanded. Julian Bell arrived first, the nephew. He was handsome in the negligent way that depends upon good tailoring and fatigue-worn like decoration. He wrote essays for papers and reviewed books nobody finished. He kissed his uncle's cheek with practised affection and looked at Clara too directly. Then came Dr. Lydia Fane, removing gloves finger by finger while Molly hurried to take her coat. She was in her middle 40s, composed without coldness, with dark hair already touched at the temples by white, and a face whose repose made confession seem not only possible but reasonable. Ambrose greeted her with unmistakable warmth. "You see how I am watched," he told Clara. "If I sneeze..." "Lydia diagnoses me before the second syllable. Because you dislike rest and prefer drama," Dr. Fane replied. "Men with shops and opinions are always the most tiresome patients. They think taste is a substitute for obedience." She said it smiling, and he received it smiling. But Clara saw Molly's head lift sharply, as if she had heard something else under the banter, when the talk turned to the forthcoming catalogue and the rumours around the Lonsdale inheritance. Julian lounged by the fireplace and said, "London has already decided the collection contains either a genuine marvel or a very elegant fraud. My uncle adores that sort of uncertainty. It gives him colour." Ambrose's smile thinned. People who live by newspapers should not sneer at anticipation. No sneer, only admiration. A scandal is the one form of truth the city always reads to the end. Miss Marple, who was buttering a slice of bread with careful concentration, said, "That is very like Mr. Pritchard's budgerigar, you know. In St. Mary Mead learned to shout only 2 phrases, 'Who's there?' and 'Shame on you.' Quite sufficient for village life, and really for London too from what I have seen." Everybody laughed. Everybody except Molly. When tea was over, and the others drifted away, Clara followed Ambrose up the iron stair to the mezzanine and through to the theology room at the back. It was narrower than she expected, with 2 high windows, rows of unsteady shelves, and a desk beneath one window covered in lists. Here the air changed. It was more stale, and there was a faint bitter scent Clara could not place at once, as though an orange peel had dried long ago in a shut drawer. Ambrose set down a ledger. "Work begins tomorrow. Today you may look about and judge how impossible I have made things." Clara ran her fingers over the nearer spines. A good collection indeed. Some books had been penciled discreetly inside with shelf numbers. Others bore no marks. On the desk lay a blotter, an uncapped fountain pen, and beside it a cheap child's marble, red, shot through with white, as out of place as the glove downstairs. "Do you have children visiting?" she asked. Ambrose turned too quickly. "Children? Certainly not. Books are damaged enough by adults." He picked up the marble and slipped it into his pocket. Clara said nothing. Yet as he spoke of bindings and provenance and the laziness of provincial auctioneers, one fact stayed in her mind quite apart from his words. The desk held 1 cup ring in the dust, not 2, but the saucer by the blotter had recently been washed and put back upside down. Someone had made tea for another person and been careful afterward. That night, when Clara left by the green door, the bell gave its bright note overhead. She looked back once from the pavement. Through the bowed glass she saw Ambrose Bell standing alone behind the counter, the red glove in his hand again, staring at it as if it had spoken. The next morning he was dead. Chapter 2. An Unconvincing Accident. It was Molly who found him, though Clara never entirely believed that found was the proper word for such things. Discovery suggests surprise. Molly came through the back passage with the expression of a person already braced against what she feared, carrying a tray with a single cup and the Morning Post, and when the tray slid from her hands, the cup broke so cleanly that the handle remained whole while the rest of it spread in white petals over the floorboards. Ambrose Bell lay beside the desk in the theology room, half turned onto one shoulder as though he had gone down while reaching for something. His face was not violent. That, Clara thought later, was perhaps what made it worse. A violent death can seem like an event. This was humiliatingly private. His mouth was slightly open. One hand had clutched at the edge of the desk and dragged a sheaf of cataloguing slips into a fan over the floor. Near his fingers rested the uncapped fountain pen, and beneath the desk a dark stain spread from an overturned cup. Molly had not screamed. She stood with both hands against the wall, breathing in frightened little catches, while Clara knelt and then rose again almost at once because there was no point in pretending usefulness. Dr. Fane, sent for at once from 2 streets away, arrived within minutes. She examined him with swift professional economy and then straightened. "He's been dead a little while," she said. "I cannot certify with complete peace of mind until I look more closely downstairs, but it may have been his heart. He complained of strain often enough." Julian came up the stair 2 at a time and stopped short in the doorway. "Good God!" Miss Marple had come too, brought by Mrs. Pritchard, though no one could later say exactly how. She stood just beyond the threshold, small and still, her hands folded over her handbag. Julian passed a hand across his face. He did have pain at times, Lydia warned him. Doctor. Fane gave him a quick look. I warned him to rest. That's not the same as predicting him onto the floor. Inspector Wells from the local station was not a man given to subtleties of posture. He entered rooms by occupying them. Yet he had the decency to lower his voice in the presence of the dead, and to be polite to Miss Marple, which Clara marked in his favour immediately. Routine questions, he said. I dare say it is nothing worse than misfortune, but we shall do things properly. Who last saw Mr. Bell alive? The answers came in sequence. Clara had left at 6:30 the previous evening. Molly had gone shortly after, having closed the till. Julian had dined with friends and had not returned. Dr. Fane had left after tea. Mrs. Pritchard had seen the front shutters fastened at 8 by Ambrose himself. He often worked late upstairs. Anyone else with the key? Asked the inspector. Julian said, I have one. Molly has one to the front. My uncle kept a back key in his desk. Molly, twisting her apron between her fingers, said, The back door was locked this morning, sir. I came in the front. Inspector Wells grunted. And windows? All fast, Clara said. The two in here open a little at the top, but not enough for a person. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the saucer and the stain beneath the desk. There were 2 cups yesterday afternoon, she said. Has Mr. Bell the habit of making tea alone at night? Everybody looked at her. It was Clara who answered. I noticed only 1 cup ring on the desk yesterday, but a second saucer had been washed. The inspector turned. You observed that? Clara felt faintly foolish. Only because it was odd. Odd things are useful. Dr. Fane, still composed, said, If he had a caller, that need not signify anything. He was a dealer. Dealers talk late. Miss Marple nodded. Oh, certainly. Only in villages one learns that people wash cups when they wish an evening to seem less social than it was. Mrs. Larkin in St. Mary Mead did it continually while insisting the curate had come only about roof repairs. It was a great pity, because everyone would have liked her much better if she had simply admitted she was lonely. Julian gave an impatient laugh. Are we to proceed by village anecdote? Inspector Wells said dryly. I'll proceed by whatever turns out to be true, sir. He moved carefully about the room. There were no signs of struggle, yet a book lay open on the floor several feet from the body, too far to have fallen from the desk. A catalogue drawer stood ajar. On the sill by the high window lay a narrow band of dust broken by 3 clean marks, like the tips of fingers or the edge of a small object recently lifted away. Mr. Bell was involved in something disputed, the inspector asked. Julian shrugged with visible reluctance. There has been unpleasant talk. A few people suggest some rare books in the Lonsdale lot may not be precisely what they appear. Booksellers gossip with moral fervour when money's involved. My uncle was delighted when the talk concerned other men. Clara watched Molly at that. The girl's knuckles whitened. Forgery, then, said the inspector. Rumour, Julian corrected. And not, I think, very good rumour. Miss Marple, who had gone close to the shelves, bent over a row of small devotional books. How very untidy, she murmured. No one attended. Clara did. 3 books had been put back upside down among the others, not merely carelessly, but almost savagely, as though returned by a hand that did not know or did not care what order meant in such a room. Ambrose Bell, from all Clara had seen, cared about order in the theatrical way that vain men care about being known to care. He would never have left it so. The body was taken away. The room emptied gradually, leaving behind the ugly neatness that follows official attention. Broken cup pieces had been swept together, though not yet removed. The stain beneath the desk lingered. Clara stood with Julian by the shelves while the inspector's constable searched the office downstairs. Julian said, This will ruin everything. She turned, thinking he meant grief, and found instead the practical misery of a man who sees inheritance turning to delay. He looked ashamed at once. I don't mean only that, he said. He was impossible, but he was my uncle. It is just that death, when mixed with trade, makes scavengers of everybody. You sound as though you know the species. I review books, Miss Vale. Half my acquaintances would steal the dead man's spectacles and call it criticism. Below them the bell on the shop door rang. A customer, ignorant and ordinary, life entering on its small business. Mrs. Pritchard shooed the poor soul out again with a firmness born of righteousness. By noon, Inspector Wells had found enough to disturb the peace of the simplest explanation. Ambrose's office safely stood open behind the atlases, but no money appeared missing. In the wastebasket was a torn envelope bearing no stamp, and addressed only in a slanting hand to A.B. tonight, after closing. In the grate, incompletely burned, lay half a sheet of paper with only a few words left legible. Never meant you to keep them. If she sees the truth, Clara saw the inspector read and folded away. She also saw Dr. Fane watching him, with an intentness too steady to be idle curiosity. When she and Miss Marple took a little air in the flagged courtyard beyond the back passage, the city seemed offensively unchanged. Milk clattered in the lane. Somebody laughed nearby. The dead vine against the wall trembled in a draught that did not reach the ground. "It cannot be his heart," Clara said. "Not only that." Miss Marple adjusted her glove. "No, my dear. People do die naturally in awkward positions, and letters do arrive naturally without stamps, but the two together so often become unnatural. One hates to say it. Human beings are forever adding little embroideries to plain cloth, and then acting astonished when one notices the pattern. You saw something else?" "Several things, I think, though seeing is one matter, and understanding quite another. The finger marks in the dust interest me. So does the child's glove, and so, rather more than I expected, does Dr. Fane's manner." Clara looked up sharply. "You suspect her?" "My dear, I suspect everybody is capable of arranging their faces. That includes most of us past 16. But suspicion is not the same as certainty. A good many people behave with composure because they are frightened, and a few because they are guilty. It is only the first sort one ought to pity." In the afternoon, Molly asked if she might speak privately. She led Clara not into the office or the back room, but into the tiny cupboard beneath the stair where old wrapping paper was kept. Her face was pale with determination. "I ought to tell someone," she said, "only I don't want it made ugly." "It has already become ugly." Molly nodded once. "Mr. Bell had a visitor last night. A woman. Did you see her?" "Not exactly. I'd gone back because I left my gloves. I heard voices upstairs and then saw a shadow through the glass over the passage door. I knew it wasn't Mr. Julian because he walks as though he expects carpets. This was slower. I was going to call out, but Mr. Bell said very sharply, 'You have no right after all these years,' and then I left because it felt wrong to stay." "Did you recognise the voice?" Molly pressed the wrapping paper roll so hard it bent. "No, only it wasn't old." "Why keep it back?" Her eyes filled at once, which made Clara trust her more than if she had cried prettily. "Because there are already whispers, miss, and the shop will be talked about. And Mr. Bell hated vulgarity more than sin. Also because Dr. Fane asked me, before the police came, whether I'd heard anything unusual, and when I said perhaps I had, she took my hands and said, 'Do be careful, Molly. People embroider what they scarcely know, and scandal hurts the innocent first.' She was kind. Too kind, perhaps. It made me feel as though I had done something silly." Clara stood very still. That evening, Inspector Wells sent word that the body would require a fuller examination after all. He did not use the word poison, but he did not need to, and when Clara went upstairs once more to the theology room, there was one thing missing from the desk that she was certain had been there the day before. The child's marble was gone. Chapter 3, The Reputation of Gentle People. London treated Ambrose Bell's death with exactly the kind of appetite he would have despised in others and cultivated for himself. By the second morning, 2 papers had carried small paragraphs on the Bloomsbury bookseller, found dead amid rumours of disputed rarities, and by luncheon, a third had enlarged the matter into a scandal whose details it did not possess but supplied from temperament. Julian arrived with the paper folded under his arm and flung it onto the counter. "This is carrion," he said. "They've got half of it wrong and the nastier half invented." Mrs. Pritchard, who had come in with ham sandwiches nobody wanted, peered at the column and sniffed. Newspapers have always been like drains. They're only noticed when something rises." Miss Marple sat in the corner by theology, mending an old glove with tiny firm stitches. She looked up mildly. "That is very true, though sometimes what rises has first been pushed down. One should not forget that." The shop had not reopened properly, but people found reasons to hover at the window and to come in asking whether Mr. Bell's funeral arrangements had been settled, by which they meant, of course, had anything exciting yet been learned. Inspector Wells had placed no seal on the premises, since the business must continue in some form, and there had been no break-in. Yet the rooms felt altered. Death in a house of trade leaves an insult behind. Objects meant to be bought and sold begin to seem as though they are keeping something back. Clara worked where she could, partly from usefulness and partly because work steadied the mind. She sorted slips, checked accession notes, and made an inventory of the office drawer contents at the inspector's request. It was during this dull task that she found the photograph. It had been tucked inside a ledger at the back, not hidden exactly, but inserted flat between pages. The picture showed a younger Ambrose Bell beside a woman in nurse's uniform, standing before the shop's old frontage, which then had a different signboard and no gilt lettering. The woman was handsome in the grave, plain way of photographs from long ago, her cap severe, her eyes unexpectedly alive. On the back, in a hand not Ambrose's, were the words, "For A, because beginnings deserve witnesses, E.M., 1947. Clara turned it over again. The woman's gloved hand rested on the shop key. Julian found her looking at it. "You've unearthed one of his relics. Who is she?" He took the picture and something passed over his face that she could not read. "Eleanor March. I know only scraps. My uncle once said she had helped him when the shop first opened after the war. He never spoke of her fondly, which means he likely owed her a great deal. Where is she now? I haven't the faintest idea. Dead, perhaps. Everyone from that era is either dead or writing memoirs. The flippancy sat badly on him. Clara said, You knew his business? Was she a partner? Julian gave back the photograph. If she had been, would there not be records? That, she thought, was not an answer. Dr. Fane came in just then, carrying a paper parcel of sandwiches and a gravity which somehow softened the room rather than weighing it down. Molly brightened visibly at her presence. So, Clara noticed, as did Mrs. Pritchard, trust is often most obvious in the way people relax their mouths. Inspector Wells had already told them privately that there were indications inconsistent with simple natural collapse. He was awaiting final confirmation. No public statement had been made. Dr. Fane, who must know more from professional channels than she could say, behaved with perfect discretion. You must all eat something, she said. Grief makes people theatrical about meals, and then they faint at inconvenient times. Mrs. Pritchard allowed herself to be instructed, which no one else managed. Julian took a sandwich and began pacing. Molly remained behind the counter, folding and unfolding a scrap of wrapping paper. Dr. Fane crossed to Clara. You've been helping the police, I hear. Only with lists. That is how truth usually arrives. In lists, bills, and the wrong object in the right drawer. Clara almost smiled. Miss Marple says much the same, only with more village examples. Oh, Miss Marple understands people far too well. It makes one nervous. She said it easily, but her eyes flickered for an instant toward the office door. Clara thought then not that she was guilty, but that she was under strain. In the afternoon, Inspector Wells returned with questions about Eleanor March. No one knew much. Mrs. Pritchard remembered a quiet, capable woman with a way of standing back and letting Mr. Bell take credit for arrangements he had not himself thought of. Julian repeated that she had vanished from the scene before his childhood memory began. Molly knew nothing at all. Miss Marple said only, There are women who withdraw so thoroughly that one notices the outline they have left only years later, when somebody else tries to stand in it. The inspector asked whether Ambrose had enemies. Every dealer has rivals, Julian replied. Every man of vanity has enemies he calls misunderstandings. But if you mean hatred enough for murder, I should have said no. Would you still? Julian spread his hands. I should say I do not know my uncle half as well as I supposed. That evening the final report arrived. Inspector Wells was blunt. Ambrose Bell had not died of a seizure of the heart. He had taken, in liquid form, a slow-acting substance that could mimic such a collapse. The quantity was not huge. It suggested calculation. The cup found spilled by the desk was being tested. So were the residues in the teapot downstairs. There was no dramatic outcry. Clara found more terrible than one. Molly sat down suddenly on the lowest stair and stared at her own hands. Julian swore under his breath and went to the window. Mrs. Pritchard crossed herself from old habit, though she did not usually advertise religion. Dr. Fane closed her eyes for the span of one breath, then opened them and said, Then you must look at everyone who offered him food or drink, and also at whatever he kept for himself. Inspector Wells said, I intend to. After he left, Clara followed Miss Marple to the little courtyard. The light had gone saffron on the upper bricks and left the flags below in a chill shadow. Miss Marple touched the dead vine with one finger. In St. Mary Mead, she said, there was a woman named Elsie Wren who married a very handsome man with musical tastes and no income. Everybody admired her devotion because she made his failures look like romance. Only years later we understood that she had done all the difficult things so often she no longer knew where her own life had gone. Such arrangements can become intolerable quite suddenly, after seeming bearable for years. You think this is about a woman who disappeared. I think, said Miss Marple, that when a man's story of himself becomes more profitable than the truth may wait a very long time before knocking, but it nearly always comes in at the wrong hour. Clara showed her the photograph. Miss Marple studied the face of Eleanor March for a long moment. A nurse, she murmured, and the key in her hand. How very revealing. Men do so hate photographs that remember the wrong hierarchy. Back inside, Clara climbed to the theology room alone. She looked again at the desk, the shelves, the broken order. Then she examined the blotter beneath the lamp and held it sideways to the light. The top sheet had been removed, but the pressure from writing on it had left the faintest indented grooves on the page below. She fetched a soft pencil and shaded carefully, feeling foolish and excited in equal measure. Words emerged, broken but legible enough. Bring the letters, or I go to the papers, you owe her name what you took from it. Below that, more jaggedly pressed, perhaps by another hand, after closing, no scenes. Clara's heart beat hard. She was still looking when she heard someone on the stairs. She covered the page instinctively. It was Molly. Her face was blotched from crying, but she had gone past tears into determination. There's something else, she said. I didn't tell because I was afraid for him, though he's past fear now. Mr. Bell had been receiving letters for weeks, not by post always, sometimes left under the till tray. He burned them after reading. Once I saw only one line before he snatched it back. What line? Molly swallowed. Ask Dr. Fane what she remembers of your beginnings. Below them the bell over the door rang, sharp and cheerful as ever. And this time the visitor was asking for a book by Eleanor March. Chapter 4. A Name on a Spine. The man who asked for Eleanor March was the sort of customer London manufactures with alarming ease and no permanence. He was young enough to seem insolent without effort, and dressed carefully enough to suggest that carelessness was beyond his means. His tie was too bright for mourning. His gloves were new. Clara, coming down from the stair with Molly at her shoulder, heard him say to Julian, "You won't have her in stock, I suppose?" "Nobody does. That rather proves the point." Julian said coolly, "It proves only that you're asking for someone obscure. If you want obscurity made fashionable, try a university press." The young man smiled. "I want obscurity explained." Inspector Wells, who by fortune or instinct had just re-entered the shop, stepped in before the exchange could sharpen. "Perhaps you'd explain yourself first." The visitor introduced himself as Sebastian Quill, a literary journalist. He produced a card and a look of offended innocence. He was, he said, researching neglected women writers of the post-war years, and had reason to believe that Bellwether Books had once been connected with one Eleanor March, whose slim memoir The Ward at Midnight had appeared in 1948 and vanished almost at once. "Connected in what way?" asked the inspector. Quill shrugged. "That is what I am trying to establish. There are whispers. There are always whispers, but some have footnotes. Miss March's surviving papers are incomplete. Her first drafts are missing. Certain passages from her book later appeared, much improved and unattributed, in essays by a gentleman who became a minor authority on literary London. I need not tell you his name." Julian went white, then angry. "This is scavenging. This is reporting." Dr. Fane, who had remained near the back counter, said in her even voice, "It is also in poor taste to arrive within a day of a man's death and fish in his ashes." Quill bowed slightly. "Poor taste is often only punctuality judged by people who would have preferred more time." Inspector Wells took his card, his address, and the details of how he had learned of Eleanor March. It came, unsurprisingly, through a source he would not name, and a letter received some weeks earlier, inviting him to look into the woman Ambrose Bell buried without a grave. Quill had thought it metaphorical. Now he seemed less certain. "Did you know Mr. Bell?" asked the inspector. "Not personally. He disliked journalists who read beyond catalogues." "Did you visit him before today?" "No, though I wrote asking for an interview and received no answer." Clara watched Miss Marple during this. The old lady had taken up a thin octavo from the counter and was turning pages without apparently listening. Yet when Quill spoke the phrase "buried without a grave," one finger stilled on the margin. After he had gone, leaving irritation behind him like scent, Julian swore again. "This is filth. My uncle had enemies in print, that's all. Obscure women writers and stolen phrases. Every critic alive borrows a thought and makes a career of it." "Borrowing becomes theft when one does not return the goods," Miss Marple said gently. "At least so the library in St. Mary Mead always maintained. Though books are easier to count than lives." Julian stared at her. "Do you honestly think my uncle stole someone's work?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that one should never ask a question before being ready for an answer. It so often encourages the wrong sort of courage." Clara spent the next hours in the cramped back office with ledgers and invoices. She found references to Eleanor March nowhere under that name. Yet in the earliest books of account from the years just after the war, there were entries initialed E.M. in a tighter hand than Ambrose's, mostly payments to suppliers and notes about hospital library clearances, estate remnants, and charitable disposals of private collections. The handwriting stopped abruptly midway through 1948. After that, only Ambrose remained, expansive and self-congratulatory even in bookkeeping. One line caught Clara's eye: July 12th settlement for EM final. No amount given, no explanation. When she showed it to Inspector Wells, he frowned. "Settlement suggests money. Or silence," Clara said. "Same thing sometimes." Downstairs, Molly was serving an elderly clergyman who had come not to buy but to condole at length. It gave everyone an excuse to keep moving. Dr. Fane took her leave at last, saying she must return to her patients. She paused by Clara before going. "You look tired. Do not make a religion of investigation, Miss Vale. It tempts people into righteousness." Clara said, "Did you know Eleanor March?" There was the smallest pause, not silence, a measure. Then Dr. Fane said, "I knew of her. My mother mentioned her once or twice. They were acquainted years ago. Was your mother nursing too?" "Yes." Something in the answer made Clara ask, "And did Mr. Bell take something from Eleanor March?" Dr. Fane looked at her then with real weariness, not offence. "My dear, men like Mr. Bell are always taking things. Credit, affection, time. One does not call the police for all of it." She left without haste. Clara watched her from the window as she crossed the street. At the corner a small boy ran after a dropped ball. and Dr. Fane stooped automatically to hand it back. The gesture was so natural that Clara felt ashamed of her suspicion. That evening, Inspector Wells requested that all keys be handed over temporarily for comparison and control. Julian produced his, Molly hers. Ambrose's ring had been found in his pocket. The back key from the desk was still missing. Miss Marple, who had spent part of the afternoon asking to see anything at all by this Miss March, was given the dusty stockroom in hope of occupying her harmlessly. Instead, she emerged with a thin volume bound in faded blue and laid it on the counter before Clara. "Not by Eleanor March," she said, "but dedicated to her." Inside the cover, on the flyleaf was written, "To Nell, who taught me that tending the wounded is not the same as healing them." LF, Clara said. "Yes. Rather interesting, don't you think? Especially as the handwriting resembles the note on the back of the photograph far more than Mr. Bell ever could." "Dr. Fane?" Miss Marple nodded. "Much younger, of course." Lydia Fane must have known Eleanor March very well indeed, more intimately than she suggested. Clara felt the shape of things shift. Then why conceal it? Oh, for the usual reasons. Pain, shame, loyalty, habit. The number of human evasions is really quite small. It is only their combinations that astonish us. Molly came up then, flushed and breathless. "Miss Marple, Miss, there's a woman asking in the shop next door whether Mr. Bell's rooms will be searched again tonight. Mrs. Pritchard says she's one of the journalists from Fleet Street, but I've seen her before. She was here the day before yesterday asking about children's books." "A journalist?" said Clara. "I don't think so. She wore the same brooch both times, and journalists in my experience try to look as though they found their clothes in arguments." They went to the front, but the woman had already gone. On the pavement outside, however, Miss Marple stooped and picked up something from the doorstep. It was a broken clasp from a cheap leather satchel, and attached to it by a thread a scrap of paper. Only 3 words remained. The child, still Inspector Wells, read them and looked grim. "That glove," he said. "The marble. Now this. Were there children involved with this Eleanor March?" Nobody answered. Miss Marple folded the scrap in her palm. "Not involved, perhaps," she said softly. "Only hidden, which is much the same thing in families." That night, Clara lay awake in her lodging, hearing the city carts long after midnight, and thinking of the glove on the glass case, the marble on the desk, the missing back key, the hidden letters, and Dr. Lydia Fane's inscription to Nell. When at last she slept, she dreamed not of books or bodies, but of a child standing in a shop and being told, in a voice too calm to be contradicted, that some names belonged on spines and some did not. In the morning, Inspector Wells had news that ought to have simplified matters, and instead made them worse. The substance used on Ambrose Bell had once been prescribed, years earlier, in liquid form by a physician now retired. That physician had been Lydia Fane's father. Chapter 5. What was carefully forgotten. The inspector did not arrest Dr. Fane. Had he done so, the business of understanding might almost have become simpler, and life is rarely so obliging. Instead, he came early with that heavy patience policemen develop when a case threatens to slide into society rather than remain obediently criminal. "It is not current stock," he said to Clara and Miss Marple in the back room. "The retired doctor's records are patchy. The preparation was once used in certain cases, though seldom. There is no proof Dr. Fane possessed it recently, but the connection exists." Julian, leaning against the mantelpiece, seized upon this with indecent relief. "Then you have your line at last." Miss Marple looked up from the account book in her lap. "People do so love a line when it points away from themselves. It must be very soothing." Julian flushed. "You cannot expect me to pretend Lydia is above the question. Certainly not. Only above convenience." Dr. Fane came in while they were still speaking, having been sent directly by the inspector. She did not ask why. One saw at once she knew. She took off her gloves, folded them precisely, and laid them on the table. "You may ask whatever you need," she said. Inspector Wells did. Did she know the substance? Yes. Had she access to any old stores from her father's practice? None that she was aware of. Had she known Eleanor March personally? Yes. Why had she minimized that before? Because privacy is not a crime, and because the dead, once handed to police and newspapers, are not often treated with delicacy. "Who was Eleanor March?" asked the inspector. Dr. Fane stood very still. "She was my mother's dearest friend. They trained together during the war. Eleanor later helped Mr. Bell establish this shop. She wrote a small book from her nursing notes. It was praised, then forgotten. She disappeared from London not long after." "Disappeared voluntarily?" Dr. Fane said. "That depends whom you ask." Miss Marple's voice came gently from the corner. "And if one asked you, my dear?" A muscle moved once in Lydia Fane's throat. "I should say she was made to feel that there was no place for her to stand and remain herself. Just some people call that choice because no door is locked." Inspector Wells asked, "Did Mr. Bell wrong her?" "Yes." "How?" "In ways difficult to prove and easier to live with than to revisit. That is not sufficient." "No," she said. "It is not." Clara watched her. It was not merely grief in the woman's face. It was the exhaustion of a long discipline under sudden strain. She thought of Miss Marple's remark about seeing and understanding. When the inspector left to pursue further records, Lydia remained. She looked at Clara first, then Julian, then finally at Miss Marple. "My mother once said you were the most dangerous kind of person," she said. Miss Marple smiled. Did she indeed? That was very shrewd of her. She said you noticed moral untidiness in exactly the way some women notice dust on dark wood. How flattering, Lydia almost smiled. Not meant kindly. Most useful truths are not. There was a long moment. Then Lydia said, "If I tell part of it, may part remain buried?" Miss Marple answered, "Things buried have an unfortunate habit of shaping the ground above them, but one can try." So Lydia told them this much. Eleanor March had helped build bellwether books from hospital clearances and salvage after the war. She had skill, judgment, and no instinct for self-display. Ambrose had charm, social ambition, and a gift for making introductions sound like achievements. He courted reviewers, collectors, widows with shelves, and minor patrons. He also drew heavily on Eleanor's notes, recommendations, and knowledge. Did he steal her writing? Clara asked. Lydia's eyes moved to the ledger. He took from her a great many things that had no receipts. Fragments of prose, observations, lists of books, the labour of beginnings. That sort of theft is common because it can be called influence. If one protests, one seems peevish. Why didn't she leave him? She did. That answer fell hard. She left London, said Clara. She left the shop first, then the city, then, in most people's minds, the world. There was a child by then. Julian made a startled movement. Mrs. Pritchard, who had materialised with no audible approach, and now stood horrified in the doorway, uttered a whisper of pure scandal. Lydia went on before anyone could interrupt. Eleanor had a daughter. The child was not acknowledged. My mother knew. A very few others knew. Ambrose would not marry her. He would not even permit the girl to be linked openly with the shop, because by then he was courting patronage from exactly the sort of families who forgive adultery in private and demand respectability in catalogues. And the child, asked Miss Marple, sent away for periods, taken back, moved again. It was never spoken of plainly. Eleanor refused money more than once because she said she would not have the child raised as hush. That was like her. Pride is admirable until it must feed somebody. Clara felt sick. The glove, the marble, the scrap. Was the girl here? Recently? Lydia closed her eyes once. "I do not know," Julian said hoarsely. "You imply my uncle fathered a child and abandoned both mother and daughter. Why was none of this ever told? Because society prefers refined sins. And because Eleanor vanished before she could be vulgar enough to insist." Miss Marple said, "Did she die?" Lydia looked at her. Not then. It was more frightening than if she had said yes. After Lydia left, Julian sank into the chair by the desk and covered his face. For the first time his distress seemed to have no calculation in it. "I had no idea," he said. "Or perhaps I had pieces and never put them together because not putting them together was kinder to me." Miss Marple threaded her needle again. "People are so fond of kindness when it saves effort." Clara asked quietly, "Do you think the daughter came back?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that children raised in secrecy grow into adults with very peculiar relations to doors. Some avoid them entirely. Some return and stand upon the threshold until somebody names them. And if naming does not come, they may do something regrettable." That afternoon, Clara searched the stock of children's books on a whim she could not have defended. Tucked inside a battered copy of The Wind in the Willows, she found a folded paper, old and much handled. It was not a letter, but a page torn from an exercise book. The hand was childish and careful. "Mr. Bell says I must call him Sir in the shop. Mamma says names can wait. I do not like waiting. No signature. Only at the bottom, a circle drawn in red pencil and crossed through with white. A child's marble." When she showed it to Miss Marple, the old lady sat down very suddenly. "My dear," she said, "the saddest thing in the world is not cruelty itself. It is the arrangements people make around it so they need not say the word." That evening Inspector Wells sent for Julian privately and questioned him for nearly 2 hours about money, inheritance, and his uncle's papers. When Julian returned, his habitual elegance had cracked. "He altered his will last month," he said. "Lydia witnessed it." Mrs. Pritchard nearly dropped the teapot. Clara stared. "To whom?" she asked. Julian gave a short laugh with no amusement in it. "Mostly still to me. Enough to staff and charities to preserve the appearance of conscience. But there is a sealed codicil lodged with his solicitor, not to be opened until after certain private papers are reviewed." "Private papers regarding what?" Clara said. "That," Julian replied, looking ill. "The solicitor would not tell me. Only that my uncle said the matter concerned old obligations and a false claim likely to arise." Miss Marple set down her cup. "A false claim? How very interesting. Men with guilty pasts are so apt to imagine other people liars." Then she turned to Clara and added almost to herself, "And there was another thing visible from the beginning. The glove was small but not a child's, a young woman's, worn narrow at the wrist. I ought to have said so earlier. Clara stared. Then the marble was not from a child now. No, only from a childhood remembered. The room seemed to contract around that idea. Somewhere beyond the shop, in the London dusk, a bell was ringing for evening service, and Clara understood for the first time that the woman who had come after closing might not have been there to threaten Ambrose Bell at all. She might have come to be recognised. Chapter 6. The Shape of an Inheritance. The solicitor's office in Gray's Inn had the restrained melancholy of places where paper outlives affection. Clara went there with Julian and Inspector Wells on the following morning because the codicil could not yet be formally opened, but related documents concerning bellwether books might bear upon the inquiry. Miss Marple stayed behind in Bloomsbury with Mrs. Pritchard and Molly, which Clara thought at the time merely practical and later understood to be tactical. Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor, was an elderly man with silver brows and a discreet cough, designed to remind clients that the law had seen worse behaviour than theirs and survived it. He produced deeds, a partnership dissolution from 1948, and one settlement document so brief it was almost indecent. Eleanor March accepts the sum of £200 in full relinquishment of all claims upon the business known as Bellwether Books, and upon Mr. Ambrose Bell personally. Signed, witnessed, dated. Clara said, "That cannot be everything." Mr. Fenwick adjusted his spectacles. It was what was filed. Julian read the paper twice. £200. Even then it was an insult. Some insults, said the solicitor, are accepted because the alternatives are more costly. Inspector Wells asked, "Did Mr. Bell ever discuss a daughter?" "No." "Any claimant expected?" Mr. Fenwick hesitated. "He did instruct that, should any person assert descent connected with Miss March, I was to refer the matter first to Dr. Lydia Fane before taking formal steps." "Why Dr. Fane?" The solicitor looked uncomfortable. "Because," he said, "she had been entangled in those old sentimental complications from the start." On the cab ride back, Julian stared out of the window at passing clerks and omnibuses, as though all common life had insulted him by continuing. "He used her," he said. "If Lydia knew all this and still kept near him, what does that make her?" Clara said, "Perhaps loyal to someone else, or complicit." She did not answer. The possibility had to be faced, yet still she could not fit Dr. Fane's manner to murder. Concealment, yes. Suffering, certainly. But murder required a moment of will she had not yet imagined. When they returned to the shop, they found Miss Marple in the theology room with Molly, both standing before the shelves. A number of books lay in stacks on the floor. "We have been tidying," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Pritchard from behind them snorted. "Miss Marple calls it tidying when she means ferreting." "It is such an ugly word," said Miss Marple. "And besides, it is not I who is interested in hidden compartments." Molly found them. There were indeed narrow spaces at the back of two lower shelves, masked by a false board. In one there was nothing. In the other lay a parcel wrapped in old linen tape. Inspector Wells opened it on the desk. Inside were letters, many of them. Some tied together, some loose, some clearly read and reread until the folds had worn thin. Most were written by Eleanor March, a few by Lydia's mother Anne Fane, one or two by Ambrose Bell himself, in a tone of defensive self-importance so characteristic that Clara disliked him more with every line. The letters were enough to alter the whole moral shape of the case. Eleanor had not merely helped establish the shop, she had sourced stock, written catalogue copy, kept accounts, and drafted essays under Ambrose's name for potential patrons. She had done it first in love, then in hope, then in a kind of trapped fatigue. The child, named Rosamond, was born in 1948. Ambrose refused acknowledgement. Eleanor left. She attempted to publish again and failed. She took nursing posts under assumed modesties of circumstance. She wrote to Anne Fane at intervals over the years, never quite begging, never quite admitting how poor things had become. One letter, from much later, trembled in a different hand. "Rosamond knows enough now to ask. She looks like him at moments, which feels like a joke God ought not to tell. I cannot decide whether naming him would free her or damn her to the same hunger." Another, "He sent money through a solicitor as if I were an inconvenience to be itemised. I returned most of it and then regretted my pride all winter. Do not admire me for that. There is nothing noble in the cold." Miss Marple read with her spectacles low on her nose and her mouth very soft. "Poor creature," she said. "One sees it so often. Not the exact circumstances, of course, but the mechanism. A woman gives first because she loves, then because she's already given so much that stopping feels like waste." Julian had gone ashen. "And Rosamond? What became of her?" No letter said plainly. Eleanor's last note, nearly 10 years old, was brief. "My health fails more quickly than I expected. If anything happens, there are papers Rosamond must have when she's able to bear them. I dread her meeting him. I equally dread her never doing so. After that, nothing." Inspector Wells gathered the bundle carefully. "These confirm the motive for several people," he said. They also prove Mr. Bell had reason to fear exposure. Clara turned to Miss Marple. How did you know where to look? The upside-down books, my dear. Men hide things in desks because they think like owners. Women so often hide them among domestic order. Shelves are only another sort of linen cupboard to certain minds. She touched the false back with one finger. Also, the dust here was disturbed more recently than elsewhere. It seemed a pity not to reward such effort. Molly, pale but excited, said, There's more. In the little room off the yard, the one with the old packing crates, I found a hat box with children's things. I thought perhaps they belonged to Mr. Bell's visitors long ago. There is a school certificate for Rosamond March, aged 9. They went at once. The packing room smelled of paste, old twine, and damp cardboard. Inside the hat box were relics preserved with the terrible care of people who have too little of the past and therefore save all of it. A tiny shoe, 2 exercise books, a photograph of a girl standing stiffly in a coat too big for her, and beneath these, wrapped in tissue, a woman's red gloves, much mended. Clara felt a shock of recognition. The glove, Miss Marple lifted one gently. Not these exact ones. The one in the shop was newer, but the same colour. One can quite imagine a woman keeping to a colour because it belongs to memory. Inspector Wells said, If Rosamond is alive, we must find her. Yes, said Miss Marple. Quickly, because if she came that night and found her father prepared to deny her again, the impulse to say too much or too little afterward might ruin her. Julian said abruptly, Lydia would know where she is. Nobody contradicted him. Dr. Fane, when brought again to the shop, listened as the letters were described and the hatbox shown. She did not faint or protest. Only once did her face break, and that was over the small shoe. She kept that, she whispered. Nell always kept impossible things. Did you know where Rosamond was? Asked the inspector. Yes. The word fell with dreadful calm. Then you will tell me? Lydia raised her head. Rosamond married under another name years ago. She lives quietly in Hampstead. She has 2 children. She wanted nothing from Ambrose Bell except, once in her life, the truth said aloud. Did she visit him the night he died? Lydia did not answer at once. Clara saw then not guilt exactly, but choice. At last, said Lydia. She did. Chapter 7. A very reasonable silence. Rosamond had not come to the shop when summoned. That fact, more than any protestation, persuaded Clara she was neither melodramatic nor hardened. Instead, a note arrived by messenger in a plain envelope addressed to Inspector Wells. I will not be hunted like a scandalous woman in a novel. If you wish to speak to me, come to my house and do not bring the newspapers there. My children know nothing of this. The note was signed by Mrs. Rosalind Gray. Rosamond became Rosalind, Miss Marple said quietly. Names altered just enough to hurt less. The house in Hampstead was respectable, modest, and lived in with the sort of care that indicates hard-won order rather than natural abundance. Clara went with the inspector and Miss Marple at Lydia's request, though Lydia herself was not invited and did not press. Julian was explicitly excluded, which suggested sense. Rosalind Gray opened the door herself. She was in her late 30s, perhaps, with a composed face that had once been pretty and might still become so when unguarded. Her hair was dark and simply dressed. Only her hands betrayed her, one worrying at the other thumb joint in a rhythm so practised it had ceased to look like nerves. On the table in the sitting room stood a bowl of apples, a school satchel, and beside them, astonishingly, a red marble striped with white. Clara's eyes went to it. Rosalind saw. My son's, she said. At least, that is what he thinks. Miss Marple sat down as if on a friendly call and accepted tea. There are few weapons greater than normality against someone expecting either accusation or pity. Inspector Wells asked the necessary question first. Did you visit Ambrose Bell on the night of his death? Yes. Why? Rosalind looked straight at him. Because Dr. Fane persuaded me it was time to end the old cowardice. Mine as much as his. My mother is dead. The letters existed. Mr. Bell was preparing legal nonsense against any claim I might make. I wanted nothing from his estate. I wanted him to say my mother's name and mine without behaving as if decency were blackmail. Did he? A pulse moved once in her cheek. Not gracefully. She told it in an even voice that made the facts worse. Ambrose had received her in the theology room after closing. He recognized her at once, not from recent contact but from resemblance. He told her she had no right to arrive theatrically after decades of silence. She told him silence had been his arrangement, not hers. He offered money. She laughed. He grew angry. He said if she forced matters, he would deny paternity publicly and ruin what was left of Eleanor March's name by implying instability, impropriety, and delusion. Then he added, as if it were mercy, that she might write to his solicitor in private. Rosalind's mouth tightened. I took off one glove because my hands were hot. I dropped my son's marble from my pocket. I had meant to give it back at bedtime and forgot. That is why you found such childish things and made, I suppose, whatever stories adults make when they find the relics of a child. Did you poison him? Asked the inspector. No. Did you give him anything to drink? He had already poured tea. There were 2 cups. I did not touch mine after the first sip because he made me feel suddenly and absurdly as if I were 16 and begging. I hated him for that. Then what happened when you left? I told him there were letters. I said if he denied my mother again, I would let the whole story out. He looked frightened then. Not me. Of someone else, I thought. Or of the shape his life would take in other people's mouths. I left by the back because he did not want me seen. Using the desk key? He took it from the drawer. After I left, I heard someone in the shop below. A woman's voice. I thought it was the assistant and went on. Clara's heart kicked. A woman's voice. Did you know it? Rosalind looked at Miss Marple before answering. I thought it might be Lydia. Miss Marple asked gently. Because you knew she meant to come? Rosalind hesitated. She had said she might speak to him herself if he behaved badly. She was angry when I left her that afternoon. Angrier than I had ever seen. Inspector Wells said, Why not tell this sooner? Because Lydia has been the only person in my life who knew the truth and did not make me feel stained by it. There it was at last. Loyalty. Terrible and simple. They were quiet for a moment. Outside in the lane, children shouted over some game impossible to recover once one has grown. The sound seemed almost cruel. Miss Marple looked at Rosalind with great kindness. Did your mother hate him to the end? Rosalind's face altered. No, that was the worst of it. She despised herself more than she despised him. She would still defend some little gesture of his 20 years after it ceased to deserve defence. I used to think love must be a disease if it survived humiliation like that. Miss Marple nodded. It very often does. On the way back, Inspector Wells was grim. This points directly at Dr. Fane. Clara said, or at someone Rosalind wishes to protect. Yes, but it points. Miss Marple, looking out at the passing trees, said, Needles point too, and not always toward what pricks. Back at the shop, they found Lydia waiting in the courtyard, bareheaded in the afternoon light. She knew from their faces what Rosalind had said. I went thereafter, she said, before the inspector could speak. There is no use in dissembling now. Clara felt her throat tighten. I found Ambrose alive, Lydia continued. Not well, but alive. He was sitting at the desk with the letters out and his hands shaking. He said Rosalind had threatened to expose him, that I must stop her, that women like Eleanor always made ruin sound like principle. I thought then I might strike him. Instead, I told him if he did not put the truth in writing before morning, I would take the letters myself to the papers and to his solicitor. Did he drink tea while you were there? Asked the inspector. He had. There was a cup on the desk and another scarcely touched. I did not pour anything. I left him writing. What time? Near 8. Was he alone? Yes. The inspector said, You understand this is very difficult to reconcile with the poison. Lydia met his eyes. I understand. Difficulties have made my acquaintance. After he'd gone to confer with his constable, Clara stood with Miss Marple in the now-shadowed courtyard. If Lydia found him alive after Rosalind left, Clara said, then Rosalind could not have done it. But if Lydia was the last known visitor, yes. You still do not believe it. Miss Marple touched the dead vine again. Belief is too emotional a word. Let us say the pattern displeases me. It is too neat where such histories are usually ragged. What is wrong with it? The same thing that was wrong with Mrs. Gloucester's account books in St. Mary Mead. Her husband insisted she'd made an error in the coal tallies, and everything did indeed add up beautifully, only the figures were so graceful one could see they had been written after the event, which no honest muddle ever is. Clara stared. You mean Lydia's story has been arranged? Oh, certainly. But by whom, and for what purpose, remains to be seen. That night Molly came to Clara's lodging in tears. She had searched the office again and found, lodged behind the skirting near the safe, a tiny glass phial with the stopper missing. It smelled faintly bitter. Inspector Wells took it at once, and in the same hiding place there was also a torn half-sheet in Ambrose Bell's hand. Lydia, if you still have any mercy, help me manage this before it breaks everything. The inspector, upon reading it, said what everyone feared. That is enough for an arrest. Miss Marple folded her hands. It is enough, she said, for a mistake. Chapter 8. What the bookseller feared. Dr. Lydia Fane was not taken dramatically. There were no handcuffs in the shop, no outcry from the pavement, no vulgar scene to satisfy the city, and Inspector Wells came early and spoke to her in the back room while Molly wept silently over the till, and Mrs. Pritchard muttered prayers that sounded suspiciously like disapproval of the law. Lydia listened, asked only whether Rosalind had been told, and then said she would come quietly. Julian, when he heard, sank with visible relief into certainty. It had to be her. All that intimacy, all that concealment, and the note to her. God help us. It had to be. Miss Marple looked at him with such mild distaste that he coloured. It is extraordinary, she said, how often people say had to when they mean suits me to suppose. Clara could not settle. She spent the morning moving uselessly between the desk, the front counter, and the shelves. Everything appeared to accuse Lydia. The old medical connection, Her concealment of Rosalind's identity, her presence at the shop that night, Ambrose's note asking her help, the file hidden near the safe, and yet the very abundance of it made Clara uneasy. Truth usually comes in awkward scraps. This had acquired a dreadful symmetry. By noon, Miss Marple asked Clara to fetch the blue memoir by Eleanor March, the exercise book page, and the photograph from the office drawer where the inspector had allowed copies to remain. She laid them beside one another on the desk. "What do you see?" she asked. "A woman erased, a child unnamed, a man who thought ownership could settle moral questions." "Yes?" "And something smaller." Clara looked again. The photograph showed Eleanor with the shop key. The exercise book page mentioned being told to call him Sir in the shop. The memoir bore no bellwether imprint at all, but a tiny publisher's device from a bankrupt press in Islington. "He kept her out of the shop name," Clara said slowly. "Exactly. He took the labour but not the public association. That sort of exclusion becomes a habit. If Rosalind came wanting recognition, he would default not merely to denial but to classification. Put away the woman, hide the child, keep the brand." Clara almost laughed in spite of herself. "You make it sound like shelving." "My dear, most sins are only selfishness with stationery." Then she asked something stranger. Who prepared tea for Ambrose Bell usually when he worked late? Molly, if she was there, or he did it himself. Would he let visitors go into the little pantry? Not willingly. Would Lydia know where everything was? Yes, after years of coming and going. Miss Marple nodded, as if confirming not guilt but geography. She then went downstairs and asked Molly to show her exactly how the tea things were kept. Molly, subdued and sniffling, obeyed. The pantry off the passage held a kettle, a chipped tray, a caddy, milk jug, cups on hooks, and a little bottle of sweet syrup Ambrose sometimes used instead of sugar because it dissolved quickly, and he considered lumps provincial. Miss Marple held up the bottle to the light. "Has this always been here?" Molly shook her head. "No, miss. That one is new. The old bottle broke last week. Who replaced it?" "Mr. Julian brought it from the chemist's. Mr. Bell liked the same kind." Clara and Miss Marple looked at one another. "But the poison was in the tea," Clara whispered. "Or in what went into the tea," Miss Marple replied. She requested at once that Inspector Wells have the syrup tested if it had not already been done. He had sent samples, but results were not yet back. When they came, late that afternoon, the room went quite still. The residue in the syrup bottle contained traces of the same substance found in Ambrose Bell. Julian laughed once sharply. "Then what? Are we to suspect the grocer?" Miss Marple said, "Not the grocer, the purchaser." He stared. "I bought the syrup, yes. That proves nothing. Lydia could have used it later." "Could she?" said Miss Marple. "You told us yesterday that you dined with friends the night of your uncle's death. We have not yet had the names verified. And you moved about this shop very freely before and after the event." Julian's face hardened. "Take care." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "Oh, I always do. It is one reason I have survived so many village fates. No, what interests me is not that you bought the bottle, though it is convenient. It is that you have been determined from the first that the whole matter should point to Lydia Fane and stop there. That suggests either strong faith in the obvious, which is rare in intelligent men, or something less creditable." Clara said, "Julian, why did you exclude yourself from the family history every time it came up? You knew more than you admitted. You recognised Eleanor's photograph. You went white when Sebastian Quill mentioned stolen passages. He looked from one to the other. Some charm left him then, and what remained was more ordinary and more dangerous resentment sharpened by fear. My uncle told me bits," he said, "enough to know there had been a woman, some muddle. An impossible child story likely to attract extortion. He always said Lydia romanticised the whole thing. He said she and her mother could never forgive him for being practical." "Practical?" repeated Miss Marple. "What a useful word. Men employ it whenever kindness might cost them." Julian moved away to the window. If Rosalind surfaced publicly, the shop would be torn apart. Quill would publish. Collectors would drop away. Every essay my uncle wrote would be pored over for theft. The value of everything would collapse. "There it is," said Clara softly. He swung round. "Do not look sanctimonious. You have no notion what reputation means in this trade. Bellwether was all he had built, all any of us had." "All of us?" said Miss Marple. Julian's expression altered. He understood too late. He had told us. Inspector Wells, who had entered unheard halfway through, shut the door behind him. "I think you may continue, Mr. Bell." Julian did not. He smiled instead, a thin, educated smile entirely stripped of warmth. "You have nothing. A bottle I bought for the pantry. A dead man who altered his will. A doctor with old loyalties and a hidden claimant. If you mean to accuse me of poisoning my uncle to preserve a shop I did not yet own, you may find a jury less literary than your old friend here." Miss Marple said, "It was not the shop alone. It was yourself." He glanced at her almost involuntarily. "There was a passage in one of Eleanor March's letters," she went on, "where she wrote that Rosamond looked like him at moments. That would trouble a vain man. But it was another passage that mattered more. She mentioned his articles and essays. Your uncle had become a minor authority, the journalist said. Yet by the time he was producing those pieces regularly, he was already more interested in acquiring credit than in exercising talent. Such men often need assistance. Later, when age slows them, they require it again, and nephews eager for success are so terribly useful. Clara felt the whole shape of it opening. Julian's reviews, his dependence on the shop's reputation, his hunger. You wrote for him, she said. He did not answer. Miss Marple continued. And lately Sebastian Quill, poking into old thefts, threatened not only your uncle's posthumous dignity, but your own present career. If Bellwether fell into scandal, people might ask awkward questions about authorship old and new, might they not? Julian's hand went to the mantelpiece. He gripped it very hard. Inspector Wells said, "We also have your dinner alibi collapsing rather badly. One friend left town, another recalls drinks, not supper. There is a window large enough for a murder and a lie." Julian gave a strange little laugh. "You will make me into a melodrama?" "No," said Miss Marple. "You did that yourself when you hid the file near the safe and left the note where it would point prettily to Lydia. It was over-careful, like those coal tallies." His head jerked toward her, and in that involuntary movement Clara saw it. Recognition, not an example of being seen. He had done it. Chapter 9. The wrong person to pity. Once the possibility had shape, evidence moved toward it with grim speed, as though facts themselves had merely been waiting for permission. Julian did not confess at once. Men of vanity seldom do. So they retreat first into argument, then woundedness, and only lastly into truth if truth can still be arranged to flatter them. Inspector Wells took him not to the station immediately, but into the office, where the safe gaped, and the ledgers sat in their old hypocrisy. Clara remained outside with Miss Marple, and could hear only murmurs through the door, rising at moments, flattening again. Molly stood by the counter, pale and stricken. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been loudly certain of Lydia's innocence half an hour earlier, without any intermediate stage of uncertainty, now denounced modern men with literary ambitions as though she had warned the world from the cradle. Miss Marple sat down and drew Molly beside her. "My dear," she said, "do not let yourself feel foolish for being frightened by the wrong person. It happens constantly, in street. Mary Mead, there was a man named Arthur Cobb who never raised his voice, and always carried parcels for elderly ladies. Everybody trusted him because of his shoulders. It turned out he'd been embezzling from the church roof fund for 7 years. People are much too impressed by gentleness in outward habits. Wolves do not always snarl." Molly, crying now in earnest, said, "But Mr. Julian was kind. He always remembered when my mother was ill. He brought me books." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "that is the difficulty. Nobody is ever only one thing. If wickedness were tidy, we should manage very much better." When at last the office door opened, Inspector Wells emerged with Julian between himself and the constable. Julian was not handcuffed yet, but the fact had become visible in his face. His composure had retreated to somewhere brittle and inward. He looked at none of them except Clara. "You all wanted a scandal," he said. "Enjoy it." "No," said Clara, surprised at the force in her own voice. "We wanted the truth. You are the one who mistook them for the same thing." He almost smiled. "That is a bookseller's distinction. The public has never cared." Inspector Wells took him away. Only then did the full account come, pieced from his admissions, the physical evidence, and what Miss Marple had already divined. Julian had known for months that Quill and others were sniffing around the old Eleanor March matter. He had also known his uncle meant to make some defensive legal arrangement, which might expose old papers to scrutiny. Ambrose, anxious and vain, had leaned heavily on Julian to draft responses, letters, and even cataloguing prose tied to the Lonsdale collection. The nephew's own career, never robust enough to stand entirely alone, depended more than he cared to admit upon borrowed Bell prestige and hidden Bellwether labour. Rosalind's reappearance panicked Ambrose. He sent for Lydia. He drafted notes. He wrote to his solicitor. Julian, learning enough of this through office papers and private conversations, saw disaster approaching from 2 directions at once, the daughter and the journalist. He had already bought the syrup bottle days before. The idea, the inspector believed, had formed gradually, which is the ugliest kind. He dosed the syrup when opportunity came, knowing Ambrose used it alone at night in his tea. Then, after Rosalind and Lydia had both come and gone, he returned later with his own key, found Ambrose collapsing, and finished the arrangement by removing traces where he could, placing the file to implicate Lydia, and shifting papers to make the room appear flurried by confrontation. "But why risk Lydia visiting afterward?" Clara asked when the inspector later explained. "He hadn't expected it," said Wells. "When he realised she'd been there, it solved a problem for him. Better witness than suspect from his point of view." Miss Marple added, "And men who improvise wickedness nearly always congratulate themselves on opportunities that would have frightened a more disciplined criminal." Lydia was released that evening. She returned not triumphantly, but with visible fatigue so deep that Clara felt ashamed of every suspicion she had ever entertained. Rosalind came too, after dark and by the yard, not wishing to be seen from the street. The two women stood for a moment facing one another among the stacked crates and the smell of twine and old paper. Then Rosalind crossed to Lydia and put her forehead against her shoulder with a small animal sound Clara knew she would hear in memory for years. "I thought they would keep you," Rosalind said. "I thought I had done it by speaking too late." Lydia touched her hair. "No, my dear. He did it all by himself in the end, as men like Ambrose teach their admirers to do." Miss Marple, tactful as ever in the important moments, wandered away to examine the dead vine. Clara joined her a little later. "You knew before the syrup test," Clara said. "Oh, more or less. The clue was not chemical at all. It was emotional. Lydia Fane had spent years containing the consequences of Ambrose Bell. Such people may break, but they do not usually frame others. Julian, on the other hand, had the quite special resentment of a dependent person who despises the source of dependence and fears losing it. That is a very active emotion. And the glove? Rosalind's, of course. Dropped in the first confrontation. Ambrose put it away rather than throw it out because it meant something. Even selfish men keep relics when guilt has had time to settle into sentiment. Very dangerous. Sentiment is guilt that has dressed me for dinner. Clara laughed despite the day. Inside the shop, Mrs. Pritchard had produced food again, because no English tragedy is permitted to continue for long without sandwiches. Molly moved more quietly now, but some ease had returned to her face. Inspector Wells, having done the unpleasant part of his duty, he stood awkwardly by the counter and accepted tea. The shop, though altered forever, had ceased to vibrate with accusation. Rosalind asked at last to see the theology room. Clara went up with her and Lydia. On the desk lay the letters, now bundled for legal review. The stain from the spilled cup was gone. The shelves stood ordered once more. Even so, the room retained the aftertaste of fear. Rosalind stood at the window. "My mother told me once that books remember the hands that use them. She said good shops feel companionable, and bad ones feel watchful." What did this one feel like to her? Clara asked. Rosalind smiled sadly. Necessary, then false, then haunted. I think the order matters. Lydia touched the stack of letters. "These will come to you now." "Yes," Rosalind said. "Yup, though it seems absurd to inherit proof after one has lived the life already." Miss Marple, coming in softly behind them, said, "Inheritance is very seldom well timed. Money comes too late, truth later still. One must take what use one can." Rosalind turned. "And what use is there in this?" Miss Marple looked round the dusty room, the desk, the shelves, the high windows that gave stingy light, to stop an old lie from arranging the lives of another generation. Rosalind bowed her head. When they left the room, Clara glanced back once. The desk seemed smaller now that Ambrose Bell no longer filled it with his importance. On the sill, the dust had settled again over the clean marks. Time, beginning its patient work. Yet one question remained, and it troubled Clara as she lay awake that night. If Julian had killed for reputation, why had Ambrose Bell altered his will at all? And what precisely had he feared in those final weeks? The answer came the next day in the opening of the sealed codicil, and it made the whole story sadder than murder alone. Chapter 10. What Solicitors Know and When. The codicil was opened in Mr. Fenwick's office with all the solemnity paper can command and none of the mercy grief requires. Present were the solicitor, Inspector Wells, Julian's legal representative, Lydia Fane, Rosalind Gray, Clara as witness to certain cataloguing matters tied to the estate, and Miss Marple, because no one had the energy to argue with her harmlessness any longer. The document was short. Ambrose Bell, acknowledging certain historical obligations, directed that a sum be settled in trust for Rosalind Gray upon satisfactory verification of identity, and that the private correspondence of Eleanor March in his possession be delivered to Dr. Lydia Fane to handle with discretion and without public display. He further instructed that no public statement be made regarding any claim of paternity unless absolutely necessitated by legal challenge. Rosalind read it without visible expression. "He meant to buy silence even in apology," she said at last. Lydia said quietly, "Yes." There was more. Enclosed with the codicil was an unsigned memorandum in Ambrose's hand, evidently never intended for anyone but himself or perhaps his solicitor. It rambled, crossed out and resumed in places, and revealed more than any polished confession could have done. He admitted taking guidance, phrasing, and organisational assistance from Eleanor March in the early years. Whereas he denied malice in excluding her publicly. He described the child as a sorrow complicated by circumstance. He complained of Lydia's perennial moral hostility and Julian's increasing importance over financial arrangements. There, at last, was the line that mattered. "The boy presses too much and too cleverly. I begin to think he has made use of me as freely as I once made use of others. This is a disagreeable sensation." Miss Marple read it and sighed. Poetic justice, she said, is often merely selfishness discovering itself in the next generation. Julian's solicitor objected to the memorandum's tone, relevance and admissibility in almost one breath. Inspector Wells only folded it away. Afterwards they returned to the shop for the dreary beginning of estate work. There were books to sort, staff arrangements to consider, valuations to delay, rooms to empty. Crime does not end business. It merely makes business obscene for a while. Clara and Lydia worked in the office after luncheon. Rosalind had gone home to her children with the letters wrapped carefully in brown paper. Mrs. Pritchard, having decided Rosalind was a very deserving person, all things considered, planned a pie for her. Molly moved in and out carrying lists. Miss Marple sat by the front window as if resting, though Clara no longer believed rest had anything to do with it. Lydia paused over a ledger. "I ought to thank you," she said to Clara. "For what?" "For not preferring the easy explanation once it was offered." Clara thought of the file, the note, the dreadful neatness of it. "I nearly did. That is human. I nearly preferred it myself for an hour in the cell. There is a kind of relief in deciding one has become the worst thing others suspect. It saves thought." Clara looked at her. "Did you ever want to kill him?" Lydia answered without defensiveness. "Once or twice. Not in the way novels mean. More in the way one wishes an old wound would simply stop dictating the shape of a room." She closed the ledger. "My mother loved Eleanor, not romantically, though perhaps the world would have found even that easier to understand than lifelong loyalty without reward. When Eleanor died, my mother kept waiting for justice as if it were a train delayed by weather. It never arrived. So I stayed near Ambrose Bell longer than dignity advised, partly out of anger, partly to know, partly because I could not bear that he should die entirely admired. That is a bitter reason to remain in anyone's orbit." "Yes," Lydia smiled faintly. "Bitterness is very adhesive." In the late afternoon, Sebastian Quill returned, pale with contrition and curiosity held in difficult balance. Inspector Wells permitted no interview. Miss Marple, however, had a word with him on the doorstep. "If you must write anything," she said, "I should avoid cleverness." There was already too much of that involved. Quill, unexpectedly chastened, removed his hat. "Will there be a statement?" "Almost certainly. There are always statements. But if I were you, I would write less about scandal and more about the number of women who build things under other names. It is a larger subject and much less fashionable." He bowed again and went away. That evening, when the front shutters were half closed and the bell muffled by cloth to stop idle callers, Molly found one last object in the back of the cupboard, where Ambrose had hidden Rosalind's glove. It was a folded sheet in Eleanor March's hand, unsent. The ink had faded brown. The letter began, "Ambrose, I have discovered at last that what humiliates me is not your refusal, but my continual hope that you will one day see me clearly." It ended, "I shall keep our daughter's life from your use, even if I cannot keep mine." Lydia read it and sat down hard. Rosalind, when told later by telephone, said only, "Then she did understand before the end." Miss Marple heard this and closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said softly, "that is usually the saddest mercy." After the call, Clara and Miss Marple stood alone in the courtyard. The city beyond the wall was going into evening with its usual sounds of wheels and voices and doors. Overhead the strip of sky had gone the pale colour of old paper. "So that was what he feared," Clara said. "Not only exposure, Julian too." "Yes, his own methods returning in another body." Miss Marple tucked her hands into her sleeves. "It happens in families, businesses, friendships, churches. One teaches selfishness for years and then acts shocked when it speaks fluently. And Rosalind? What becomes of her now?" "She goes home," said Miss Marple, "which is more than her mother was ever allowed to do in peace. Sometimes that must suffice." Clara looked at the dead vine and then at the narrow windows above. "This story does not feel like it has ended." "My dear, stories nearly never do. Courts like endings. People only like intervals." She was quiet a little, then added, "In St. Mary Mead there was a woman named Mrs. Dean who kept her best china locked away for visitors she hoped would one day be important enough. Her daughter married, had children, and moved to Canada before the cabinet was ever opened. After Mrs. Dean died, the cups were found still wrapped in the original tissue, yellow with age. That is how a great many lives go wrong, not from dramatic wickedness, but from saving the real thing for later." Clara thought of Eleanor, of Rosalind, of the letters tied in tape, of a shop built on labour hidden because it was inconveniently female and untidy to the story a man preferred. The courtyard smelled faintly of damp brick and old paper glue, and somewhere above them, in the theology room, the high windows were taking the last light without warmth. Chapter 11. Everything that was not said. The business of telling the truth, once a murder had forced it into daylight, proved messier than uncovering it. Inspector Wells had his charges against Julian. The newspapers had their version, which was not the same thing. Mr. Fenwick had his legal processes, Yet the private questions remained in bellwether books like dust no sweeping can fully reach. Rosalind returned 2 days later, not because she wished to, but because certain documents required identification, and because, as she said with a tired smile, one cannot let a whole life be settled entirely by policemen and solicitors. She came in a dark coat with one red glove tucked into her pocket and the other worn. Clara noticed the asymmetry at once and loved her for it. The shop was quieter. Curious customers had moved on to fresher material, disappointed perhaps that the case involved old letters and family meanness, rather than jewels or foreign poisons. There is never enough romance in the actual destruction of women's lives to satisfy the public. Molly had resumed proper work, though every time the doorbell rang she started. Mrs. Pritchard supervised tea with renewed militancy. Miss Marple sorted nothing and understood everything. Rosalind asked to see the front room first. She stood before the bowed windows and looked up at the signboard as though measuring something only she could see. "My mother described the colour of the paint to me once," she said. "Not the name of the shade, only that it looked, in the evening, like a pond where somebody had dropped copper coins." Clara glanced at the door. It was exactly so. "She remembered everything," Rosalind added. "That used to annoy me as a girl. I thought if she truly hated the place she would forget it. Later I understood that memory is not loyalty. Sometimes it is only unfinished work." Lydia, standing nearby, said quietly, "Nell never finished anything she valued if she could help it. That was part of the trouble. She believed endurance must eventually be rewarded by recognition. It is a very educated mistake." Julian's absence had altered the rooms more than Ambrose's death had done. The old man had dominated space. Julian had occupied attention. Without him, the air felt stripped of performance. Clara had not realised how much she disliked the effect until it was gone. Inspector Wells came that afternoon with a final set of questions for Rosalind. He did them gently. Had Ambrose ever written directly to her in recent months? No. Had Julian attempted contact? Only once, a note left with Lydia suggesting a private arrangement could be made to avoid unpleasantness. Had she kept it? She had burned it in anger. Did she regret that? Yes, Rosalind said, but only practically. After he left, Miss Marple asked, "Would you have taken money if he had offered it without insult?" Rosalind considered. "For my children's schooling, perhaps. Not for myself. That is very sensible." It felt cowardly. "My dear, children have benefited from far shabbier sources than truth. Money is not moral, only its uses." Rosalind gave a little laugh, the first Clara had heard from her that was not strained into existence. "You are not what I expected. Nobody ever is. It is why life remains so untidy." They went then to the theology room one last time to sort what remained there. The books had been boxed for valuation. The desk drawers stood open and nearly empty. The room looked peeled. Yet because of that bareness, one thing became visible that had escaped them before a penciled line on the inside wall of the lower cupboard, just above where a child might stand. Then another. Then a date beside one. Heights. Rosalind went white. "My mother brought me here," she said. "Sometimes when the shop was shut, she must have marked me. There were 3 lines in all, spaced by years. Beside the last, in a cramped, hurried hand, the initials R.M. Clara felt tears sting with no warning. Miss Marple touched the penciled marks very gently. "There you are," she said. "He hid the public child, but he kept the private one. People do these monstrous half-things so often. Not love, not decency, a mean compromise between them." Rosalind stood quite still. "I almost wish he had been wholly cruel. It would be easier." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but easier is not usually what one receives." In the bottom drawer of the desk, Clara found one last notebook, plain black and nearly empty. Most of it contained figures. At the back, however, were 3 pages in Julian's hand draft reviews, overwritten phrases, and beneath them, copied out apparently for pillage, several paragraphs from Eleanor March's memoir. Entire sentences had been underlined and then shifted into new forms. Lydia looked at it with bleak satisfaction. There it is. Second-generation theft. "Will it matter in court?" asked Clara. "Morally, yes. Legally, perhaps only as an appetite." Miss Marple said, "Appetite matters very much. It tells one what sort of person one is feeding." By evening, the important papers had been removed. Bellwether Books no longer felt like a crime scene. It felt like the shell of a false idea. Mr. Fenwick proposed that the business be sold after valuation, with staff-provided references and a charitable portion honouring literary nursing history, which was his prime attempt at reparation. Rosalind said she wanted no control of the shop. "I won't inherit a stage set," she said. Lydia nodded. Wise. Clara surprised herself by feeling grief at that, not for Ambrose or Julian, for the place itself perhaps, and for what it might have been had Eleanor's name hung above the door instead. When she said so, Miss Marple answered, "Ah, but names over doors are less important than the work done beneath them. One must not let symbolism take all the wages. Still, I agree it would have been better." That night Rosalind left with the photograph of Eleanor. the exercise book page, the little shoe, and the letters that were now safely hers. She also took, after a long hesitation, the red marble from the Hampstead bowl and the one found in the theology room, placing them side by side in her handbag. "My son will ask," she said. "What will you tell him?" Clara asked. "The truth," Rosalind replied, then smiled sadly. "A version fit for his age, at any rate. That is already an improvement on my own upbringing." After she'd gone, Clara remained in the front room with Miss Marple while Molly drew shutters. The brass bell above the door had been muffled all day, and without its ring the place seemed oddly bereft, as if speech itself had been withheld. "Will justice satisfy anyone?" Clara asked. Miss Marple considered. "Satisfy is too hearty a word. It will contain things. That is often the best the law can do. And humanly, said Miss Marple, one hopes Rosalind ceases arranging her life around a vacancy. One hopes Lydia forgives herself for all the years spent waiting near the wound. One hopes Molly learns that kindness must be judged by what it costs the giver, not what it looks like at the counter. As for the dead, well," she did not finish. She rarely did when finishing would have made the thing smaller. Outside, someone was selling chestnuts from a brazier. The smell drifted in under the door, warm and scorched and faintly sweet. Inside, on the lowest cupboard wall, the hidden height marks waited in the dark. Chapter 12. The Woman Who Poured. Too carefully. Julian's trial would come later. Statements would be typed. Evidence would be arranged into cleaner lines than life had offered. Yet before all that, there was one final matter, and Miss Marple insisted upon it with that mild persistence which always meant she had already decided. Dr. Fane, she said, ought not to go on thinking the most painful part of this was her own near arrest. It wasn't. The most painful part was something much earlier and quite small. Lydia looked at her warily across the tea table in the back room. Rosalind had not come that day. Molly was upstairs with inventories. Mrs. Pritchard had finally gone home to bully her own household. Clara sat by the range, sensing importance without knowing its shape. "What small thing?" Lydia asked. "The tea," said Miss Marple. Lydia stared. "The poisoned tea?" "No, the other tea. The cup Rosalind scarcely touched." A shadow passed over Lydia's face. "What of it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "You have blamed yourself not only for staying near Ambrose Bell so long, but for sending Rosalind there at all. You think that had you gone instead, or gone with her, or gone sooner, Julian would have lacked opportunity. That may be partly true, but there is another guilt you have never named because it seems petty beside murder." Lydia said nothing. Clara saw her fingers close hard on the saucer. "You taught Rosalind," Miss Marple went on, "to pour tea carefully and leave nothing disturbed. It is the habit of girls raised not to inconvenience ugly situations. So when she went to confront her father, she set the cup back almost neatly, though she was shaking. And because of that, every later observer assumed composure, secrecy, and control. It made her look older in deceit, and less young in hurt. You have known that all along." For a moment Lydia didn't move. Then she put down the cup very softly. "My mother taught me," she said. "I taught Rosamond because I wanted her never to look vulgar in company. God forgive me." Miss Marple's expression was infinitely kind. "Yes, that is exactly the sort of thing women are taught to repent of when the true sins belong elsewhere." Lydia laughed once, but it broke in the middle. "I told her all her life to be self-possessed, to leave no mess, to answer neatly if anyone asked. And then she walked into that room with a man who had ruined her mother through neatness, and she did it beautifully. I could kill myself for the irony." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "do not add one more tragedy merely because education has been badly distributed." Clara looked from one to the other and understood with a kind of ache how crimes are supported long before they are committed by manners, omissions, refinements, economies of truth. Lydia covered her eyes briefly. "When Nell was dying, she asked me to keep Rosamond from becoming hungry in the wrong ways. She meant for men like Ambrose. She meant for recognition. I thought I was protecting her with self-command." "You did protect her," Miss Marple said. "Not perfectly. Nobody manages that. But she has a home, children, a name she chose, and enough courage to look into the old room without being swallowed by it. Those are not small things." Lydia lowered her hands. "You make comfort sound more serious than praise." "It is." There was a knock at the front, though the shop was shut. Molly came down carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "It's from Mr. Quill, miss," she said. "For Mrs. Gray, but he said perhaps you might see it to her." Inside was a proof sheet from the paper and a note. Quill had written a piece, not yet printed, about Eleanor March's memoir and the uncredited labour of women in post-war literary trade. He asked whether Lydia or Rosalind wished to correct any factual errors before publication. The tone was unexpectedly sober. Lydia read it and said, "Well, even journalists occasionally stumble into decency." Miss Marple smiled. "Like dogs finding truffles. Uncommon, but encouraging." The proof included a short extract from the ward at midnight. Clara read it silently. It was simple and lucid and devastatingly good. No wonder Ambrose had borrowed its pulse. No wonder Julian had followed the scent of easy theft down the years. "What will Rosalind do?" she asked. "That depends whether she wants her mother restored publicly," Lydia said, "or kept in the private place where injury cannot reach her again." Miss Marple said, "People always imagine privacy protects the dead. I am not sure it does. Often it only protects the arrangements that hurt them." In the late afternoon, Inspector Wells stopped by on his way elsewhere. Julian had made a fuller statement. Not a confession in the noble sense, but enough. He admitted altering the scene and placing the file near the safe after Ambrose had collapsed. He admitted dosing the syrup earlier to precipitate a crisis without quite intending death so soon, which the inspector plainly regarded as cowardly nonsense. He blamed Ambrose, scandal, Rosalind's timing, Lydia's moral pressure, journalism, and the peculiar cruelty of reputations that take decades to build and days to dismantle. "In other words," said Miss Marple, "he blames everybody who was not holding the bottle." "More or less," said Wells. When he had gone, Molly said with sudden fierceness, "Then he's wicked." Miss Marple looked at her. "Yes, but remember how. Not by springing full-grown from a bush with a villain's face, by wanting admiration without labour, position without debt, and safety without truth. Very common ingredients, my dear. That is why one must watch them." Molly nodded as if committing a recipe to memory. And at dusk, Clara went once more to the theology room. The last boxes stood ready. The desk was bare except for a single cup, forgotten after tea. Through the high windows the evening sky shone faintly, and the smell of the room was altered now that papers had been removed. Less bitter, more plainly dusty. Miss Marple joined her there. "You have been kind," Clara said. "Oh, I hope not too much. Kindness can become meddling very quickly, and then one is obliged to continue. You solved it." Miss Marple looked at the empty shelves. "Not really. Julian solved himself by being the same kind of man as Ambrose, only with less time to polish the surface. What is sad is that Eleanor March understood the whole thing long before any of us, and still could not arrange a better end." Clara thought of the unsent letter, of the height marks in the cupboard, of Rosalind setting down her teacup too carefully while asking for the truth. "What happens to places like this?" she asked. "They are sold, repainted, misremembered, occasionally improved. Human beings are less alterable, I'm afraid." They stood together a moment more. Then Miss Marple glanced toward the lower cupboard wall where the hidden marks had been copied for Rosalind and the original left untouched. "There is one mercy," she said. "The child was there. However badly managed, however hidden, she was there. One must allow facts in their little consolations when larger ones fail." Below them, Molly called that the cab had come for Miss Marple. As Clara followed her down the iron stair, the bell above the door was unwrapped for the first time since Ambrose Bell's death. When Molly opened it, the note rang out bright and absurd and young, and for a moment the shop sounded not haunted, but merely human. Chapter 13. The Dust That Settles. 3 weeks later, Bellwether Books stood half empty. The gilt letters over the window were to be painted out by the new month. Crates went in and out through the green door. Buyers had walked the rooms with practical eyes, praising shelving and lamenting dampness, while never once sensing the weight the place had carried. That, Clara thought, was perhaps just. Buildings deserve release no less than people. She had come back for the last day of sorting, partly because Mr. Fenwick paid decently, and partly because endings, though never complete, ought to be witnessed when one has been present at the middle. Molly had accepted a position in another shop near Charing Cross where the proprietor, or a widow with excellent boots, believed in wages and strong tea. Mrs. Pritchard had taken the removal of Bellwether as a personal insult by modernity. Lydia was seeing patients again, and looking 10 years older and 20 years lighter. Rosalind had written once, a brief note thanking Clara for looking at my mother's life without turning it into a parlour story. It was the sort of sentence one keeps. Miss Marple came just before 4 in the afternoon. She wore a soft grey coat and carried, not her usual small handbag, but a parcel wrapped in floral paper. "For Rosalind's children," she said. "Books. Nothing is improving. Children can smell moral instruction at once." The front room was almost bare now. Dust showed where shelves had stood. The barred windows let in a pale London light that flattened everything, and made the surviving books look temporary. The brass bell still hung above the door. Clara wondered whether the new owners would keep it. In the courtyard the dead vine had finally been cut back. Without it the wall looked younger but less interesting. Lydia arrived soon after with Rosalind. There was less strain between them now, though not less feeling. Rosalind carried herself differently too. Not happier exactly, more accurately placed within her own life. "They wanted to come," she said of her children, "but I thought one generation at a time was enough for this address." Wise, Clara thought. Mr. Fenwick had arranged the transfer of Eleanor March's memoir rights and surviving papers to Rosalind. Sebastian Quill's article had appeared, found unexpectedly good and almost restrained. It had not made a national sensation. Clara was glad of that. Instead, it had done something rarer. It had made a few right people curious. A small press planned a new edition of The Ward at midnight, with an introduction by Lydia on nursing and obscurity after the war. Rosalind had agreed, though she still disliked publicity on principle. "I dislike it too," Lydia had said, "but I dislike erasure more." Now the four women stood in the stripped front room while workmen moved somewhere overhead. Mrs. Pritchard came and went with buns, as if fortifying a siege. Molly cried at intervals and denied it each time. There was no ceremony exactly, yet what happened had the quality of one. Rosalind crossed to the inside of the lower cupboard beneath the stair where the height marks remained. She touched them in order. Then she took from her bag a pencil and, after a glance at Lydia, drew nothing new but traced the initials R.M. once more so they showed clearly. "My son is taller than this already," she said. "My daughter will be soon. I thought, for years, that not bringing them here was strength. Perhaps it was only disgust. One can confuse the two," Lydia said. "You may bring them now if you ever wish." Rosalind smiled faintly. "No, I think not. Let the place finish." Miss Marple, who had been looking at the near-empty case where the red glove had first lain, said, "Quite right. Sentiment can be a sort of tendency if one isn't careful. They took tea standing because the chairs had gone. It seemed somehow fitting." Clara noticed that Rosalind poured hers without excessive care this time. A tiny drop fell on the saucer. Lydia saw it too and said nothing. That silence was a better sort than most. As the light began to fail, the new owner arrived, a brisk woman who intended, she said, to sell art books and cheap coffee, and to tear out the gloomy partition at the back, because London has no patience with inwardness now. Mrs. Pritchard recoiled as if slapped. Miss Marple merely smiled. "Cities do alter," she murmured to Clara, "though human beings, most regrettably, remain much the same under fresh paint." There was nothing left to do after that. Rosalind collected the last parcel of Eleanor's things. Lydia took the account books relevant to publication. Molly hugged Clara with surprising force. Even Mrs. Pritchard embraced Miss Marple, which must have been painful for both but was bravely borne. On the pavement outside, Bloomsbury moved about its own business. Students passed arguing. A bus shuddered at the stop. Somewhere far off a barrel organ was playing badly. The evening smelled of soot, pastry and wet stone. Rosalind stood looking up at the signboard one last time. "My mother was right," she said. "In this light it does look like copper under water." Lydia slipped her arm through hers. "Come away." They did, walking toward the square with their heads close together. Not like mother and daughter, not like sisters, but like two people who had at last agreed to carry the same weight from opposite sides. Clara and Miss Marple remained a little behind. "Was justice done?" Clara asked, because some foolish part of her still wanted the word. Miss Marple considered the question as one considers a mended teacup that will never quite ring properly again. "Something was done," she said. "Justice is often too grand a term for mortal arrangements. But a lie was prevented from owning yet another life, and that is not negligible." They began to walk slowly toward the station. Clara glanced back once. Through the bowed glass she could see the empty front room and, hanging above the door, the brass bell catching the last of the day. Miss Marple followed her look. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was once a little girl who planted beans along the wrong side of a wall, because she liked the shade and thought the plants might feel the same. They came up pale and rather miserable, as one would expect, and everybody laughed a little. But one pod ripened after all. I have often thought of it, not because it was miraculous, which it wasn't, but because living things do sometimes manage a small success in thoroughly unsuitable places." She adjusted her glove and gave Clara that gentle sideways smile, which always seemed to contain more sorrow than amusement. "Poor Eleanor," she said. "Poor Ambrose too, in a way, though one must never overdo compassion for selfish men or they take it as applause. Still, it is a sad business when a person spends a whole life arranging the furniture of a room and never notices what has been shut in the cupboard." The street lamps were coming on one by one. Behind them, bellwether books darkened, and in the window, just for a moment before the workman turned the key and the last light went out, the brass bell shone like a small coin dropped into deep green water.